Expect a story of survival, courage, and hope. Feel the fear as the ground shakes, the heartbreak as homes are lost, and the strength as strangers become heroes. Stay with us, because by the end, you'll know what it truly means to rebuild and never forget. Chapter 1. The City of Dreams. San Francisco in 1906. It was a city of noise, movement, and ambition. The sun rose over the bay, casting its golden light on the hills, the rooftops, and the docks where fishermen were already at work. The smell of salt, fish, and fresh bread filled the air. People woke early. They had dreams to chase. On Market Street, the heart of the city, streetcars clanged on their tracks. Horses pulled heavy wagons loaded with crates of fruit, barrels of wine, and stacks of newspapers. "Morning edition," shouted a boy, waving a newspaper in the air. Businessmen in suits and hats rushed past him. They barely noticed the headlines. Life in San Francisco moved fast. Immigrants were everywhere. Italians sold fresh tomatoes and olives in the markets. Chinese workers carried heavy baskets on their shoulders, delivering vegetables to restaurants. Irish construction workers built new homes, their hammers echoing through the narrow streets. Everyone had a role. Everyone had a dream. At the harbor, sailors unloaded goods from ships that had traveled across the Pacific Ocean. They brought silk, spices, and tea from Asia. Crowds gathered to watch the ships, marveling at the cargo. San Francisco was growing, expanding its reach across the world. But the city wasn't just about work. It had charm, elegance, and entertainment. Musicians played violins on street corners. Men in bowler hats laughed as they walked past shops selling fine clothes and jewelry. The famous Palace Hotel stood tall, its grand ballroom ready to host another evening of luxury and dancing. Inside, wealthy guests dined on oysters and champagne. Outside, factory workers grabbed a quick sandwich before returning to work. The rich and poor lived side by side, each carving out their own piece of the city. Theaters on Market Street buzzed with energy. Actors rehearsed their lines, and singers practiced their songs. Children pressed their noses against windows, staring at posters advertising the latest plays. The city's nightlife promised excitement and escape. But underneath the lively streets, something dark and dangerous waited. Hidden beneath the cobblestones and the grand mansions on Nob Hill, the earth was restless. Nobody could see it. Nobody could hear it. Yet the ground occasionally shifted, small tremors that most people ignored. Just another quake, some would say, shrugging it off. In California, tremors were normal. Why worry? The city stood strong, built on determination and dreams. But there were whispers among the older residents. The ground doesn't feel right, an old fisherman told his son. His wrinkled hands shook slightly. Something's coming. But no one wanted to believe it. Why should they? The city was alive, growing more beautiful and powerful each day. Streetcar tracks stretched farther. Factories opened new doors. schools filled with children whose parents had traveled across oceans for a better life. The future seemed bright. On warm evenings, families gathered in parks. Fathers played catch with their sons. Mothers sat on benches, sharing stories about the past. Many had come from places far away: Italy, Ireland, China. They had survived hardships and hoped San Francisco would be the place where their children thrived. They looked at the glittering city and felt hope. But hope wasn't enough to change nature. Beneath the surface, the tension built. Every crack in the earth pulled tighter, waiting for the moment to snap. But on this particular day, the people of San Francisco didn't worry. The city sparkled in the sunlight. Its streets were full of life. Merchants called out to customers, and friends gathered at cafes. Nobody suspected that their world would soon be shaken. Not yet. For now, San Francisco was the city of dreams, a place where anything felt possible. But the earth had its own plans. Chapter 2. A warning beneath our feet. For weeks, something stirred beneath San Francisco's streets. The ground hummed softly, like a distant drumbeat. Most people barely noticed. The dishes in their cupboards rattled slightly. A picture frame would tilt on the wall. But then, the shaking would stop, and life would go on. Just another small tremor, people would say with a shrug. In California, tremors were as common as morning fog. Children would giggle when the floor beneath them wobbled. Bakers in their kitchens paused for only a second before kneading their dough again. No one was concerned. But others, those who paid close attention, felt uneasy. They noticed things that didn't feel right. The air, thick and heavy, had a strange stillness. Birds, usually noisy at dawn, were quieter. Dogs barked for no reason. Some refused to enter certain buildings. People whispered about animals acting strangely, but no one took it seriously. Old fisherman Tom spent his mornings by the bay, casting his line into the cool water. One morning, as he sat on the dock, he felt a sudden shiver in the wood beneath him. It wasn't much, a small shake, but it made him pause. He rubbed his hands together and looked toward the city. The fog hugged the buildings like a blanket. "Something's wrong," he muttered. His friend laughed. "Tom, it's just the usual. This is San Francisco." But Tom shook his head. He had lived here for over 40 years. He knew the rhythm of the city, and this felt different. In Chinatown, shopkeeper Mrs. Lee swept the floor of her small grocery store. As she pushed the broom across the wooden floor, she noticed the jars on the shelves tremble. "Strange," she whispered, stopping to listen. The room went silent for a moment. She sighed and continued sweeping, but her mind couldn't forget the vibration beneath her feet. She thought of the stories her grandmother used to tell, stories about the earth's anger. "When the ground talks," her grandmother would say, "listen." On the other side of town, in a small schoolhouse, a group of children sat at wooden desks practicing their writing. Suddenly, the floor beneath them wobbled, causing their pencils to roll. The teacher, Miss Evelyn, smiled. "Don't worry," she said, trying to keep the room calm. It's only a little shake. Finish your sentences." But even as she spoke, her fingers tapped nervously on the desk. She couldn't help but glance toward the window, her eyes scanning the horizon. For some, the tremors were more than just annoying. They were warnings. But what could they do? Who would listen? Mayor Eugene Schmitz, the city's leader, received reports about the small earthquakes. He brushed them aside. "We're fine," he said confidently. "We've seen worse. San Francisco is built to last." But beneath the city, deep underground, the earth was shifting. Rocks that had been locked together for years began to grind and press. The tension grew stronger every day, like a tightly wound spring waiting to snap. Scientists would later call this the movement of the San Andreas Fault, but back then, very few understood what was happening below. People carried on with their lives. Street vendors sold roasted peanuts and fresh oranges. Miners from nearby towns brought gold to the city banks. Women shopped for dresses in Union Square. But for those who sensed the warning signs, the uneasiness never left. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting the city in a soft orange glow, a young couple walked along the beach. Their bare feet sank into the cool sand. They laughed and held hands, unaware of what lay ahead. But as they walked back toward the city, they noticed something odd. The waves lapped against the shore in a strange rhythm. Slower, softer, as if the ocean itself held its breath. In the heart of the city, gas lamps flickered to life. The streets began to quiet as people returned home. Windows were shut, doors locked, and lights dimmed. But as San Francisco slept, the earth didn't rest. It kept shifting, groaning, preparing. The small tremors grew stronger, though most wouldn't notice until it was too late. Mrs. Lee, lying in her bed, couldn't sleep that night. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence around her. "Why does the air feel so heavy?" she whispered. She thought of her grandmother's voice again. "When the ground talks, listen." A few blocks away, old Tom tossed and turned in his cot near the dock. His fishing nets hung neatly on the wall, but his mind was tangled. He dreamed of giant waves crashing against the shore, of boats being tossed like toys in a bathtub. When he woke, he wiped the sweat from his brow and looked out the window. The water was calm. Too calm. In the distance, far below the city's surface, the tension reached its peak. The rocks that had held firm for so long were on the verge of release. The final warning had already passed, but no one knew it. Not yet. Morning was only a few hours away, and so was disaster. Chapter 3. Before the Dawn. April 18th, 1906. The city slept under a blanket of mist. The air was cool, damp, and still. No wind stirred the trees. No sound broke the quiet except for the gentle splash of water against the docks. San Francisco's harbor was calm, as if the sea itself had drifted into a dream. At the water's edge, fishermen were already awake. Their boats rocked gently in the fog. They cast their nets, watching them disappear into the dark water. "Looks like a quiet day," one of them said, rubbing his hands together to warm them. He yawned and stretched, unaware of the chaos that waited just beyond the horizon. In the narrow streets of the city, horses pulled milk carts. The clatter of hooves echoed off the brick buildings. A milkman whistled as he delivered bottles to doorsteps. His song floated through the mist like a ghostly melody. Lights in the houses stayed off. People slept soundly. They had no reason to worry. Inside a small bakery, warm bread was rising in the oven. The baker wiped flour from his hands and stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. He loved this time of day, the quiet before the city came alive. He didn't know that, in a few hours, his shop would be nothing but ash and rubble. On Nob Hill, where the city's wealthy lived, mansions stood in silence. Curtains were drawn, and gas lamps flickered softly inside. A maid in one of the grand homes tiptoed through the kitchen, careful not to wake the family upstairs. She hummed a tune her mother had taught her, dreaming of the day she could visit home again. But today, her life would change forever. At the firehouse, the men on duty were half asleep. One stretched out on a wooden bench, his boots resting on the floor. The fire bell, silent for now, hung on the wall like a forgotten decoration. The captain, leaning back in his chair, snored quietly. Outside, the city waited, unaware that the bell would soon ring louder than ever before. The sun had not yet risen, but factory workers were beginning their long day. They shuffled toward the city's industrial zone, their breath visible in the cold morning air. A young man named Daniel, carrying his lunch wrapped in cloth, walked with his head down. He thought about the day ahead, about the machines he would operate, about the wages he hoped to save for his family. He didn't know that by noon his factory would be gone, buried under bricks and metal. Near the bay, a young girl named Anna slept peacefully in her small bed. Her mother tucked the blanket around her shoulders, kissing her softly on the forehead. Anna dreamed of the seaside, of running barefoot along the sand. Outside their window, a foghorn sounded in the distance. The mother smiled, unaware that her world was about to shatter. The city's famous cable cars, lined neatly along the tracks, sat waiting for their morning passengers. They were silent giants, their wheels at rest. Soon, they would carry businessmen, shoppers, and children through the hilly streets. But today, their journey would end early. By mid-morning, their tracks would be twisted, their wheels buried under debris. As the clock struck 5 a.m., the world remained peaceful. A dog barked once, then fell quiet. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the alleys. The bay stretched calmly into the distance, the mist still thick and heavy. It was the kind of morning that promised a normal day, the kind of morning that gave no hint of disaster. But deep beneath the city, the earth was waking. The pressure along the San Andreas Fault had reached its breaking point. For years, the ground had held this tension. Now, it could hold no longer. Rocks that had once fit together perfectly were slipping, cracking, grinding against each other. The fault line stretched for miles, splitting the land like a crack in glass. At 5:11 a.m., a faint tremor passed through the ground. It was soft, barely strong enough to rattle a cup on a shelf. Most people didn't feel it. Those who did turned over in their beds, thinking it was nothing. Just another small shake, they thought. The kind that comes and goes. But this was no ordinary tremor. At 5:12 a.m., the earth roared to life. The ground didn't just shake, it bucked and twisted. Cobblestones cracked, buildings groaned as if alive. Horses screamed and reared up, their hooves slipping on the trembling streets. The firehouse bell clanged violently as the walls around it trembled. The sleeping firemen jumped to their feet. The captain shouted, "Get up! Get ready!" Glass shattered. Bricks tumbled. Families woke to the sound of falling furniture and cracking walls. Anna's mother grabbed her daughter, pulling her close as their small house swayed. The young girl cried, her eyes wide with fear. "What's happening, Mama?" she whispered. Her mother held her tighter. Daniel, just outside his factory, fell to the ground as the pavement shifted beneath him. He looked up and saw a brick wall collapse, sending dust and debris into the air. People ran in every direction, their voices lost in the deafening roar of destruction. In the harbor, fishermen dropped their nets. Their boats rocked wildly as the water churned. One man shouted, "Row to shore!" But the docks were splitting apart. Wooden planks cracked and sank beneath the waves. And above it all, the city itself seemed to scream. Roofs caved in. Chimneys collapsed. The grand mansions on Nob Hill, symbols of wealth and power, cracked like fragile porcelain. Fires sparked from broken gas lines. Smoke rose into the air, dark and thick. San Francisco had woken to its worst nightmare. The calm before the dawn was gone. And now, the battle to survive had begun. Chapter 4. The Earth Awakens. At 5:12 a.m., it began. The ground shuddered violently, as if some giant beast had awakened from a deep sleep. The noise was deafening, roaring like thunder, crashing like waves against cliffs. The earth twisted, cracked, and groaned under the strain. Streets that were once smooth now buckled and broke. Cobblestones shot into the air like thrown dice. On Market Street, a streetcar tipped to one side, its wheels squealing as they slid off the rails. The conductor gripped the handrail tightly. His face turned pale as glass windows shattered around him. "Hold on!" he shouted. Passengers screamed, their bodies thrown against the walls. In Chinatown, shopkeeper Mrs. Lee was thrown to the floor. Her shelves collapsed, spilling jars of rice and tea across the room. Pots clanged, bottles smashed, and the smell of soy sauce filled the air. She crawled under a table, covering her head as the walls trembled. "Stop. Please stop," she whispered, her voice shaking. But the earth didn't listen. On Nob Hill, the grand mansions of the wealthy trembled like fragile toys. A crystal chandelier in one home swayed wildly before crashing to the floor, its delicate pieces scattering like raindrops. The residents, dressed in silk nightgowns and robes, ran from their bedrooms. "Get outside! Now!" shouted one man, grabbing his wife's hand as the floor beneath them cracked. In a small wooden house near the docks, little Anna clung to her mother's neck. The walls around them groaned like an old ship in a storm. The wooden beams creaked as if they would snap at any moment. Anna sobbed. "Mama, I'm scared." Her mother held her tightly, whispering, "It's going to be okay, my love. Just hold on." But even she wasn't sure if they would make it out alive. Meanwhile, down by the harbor, the fishermen struggled to control their boats. The calm water had turned violent, tossing their boats like leaves in the wind. The docks split apart, wooden planks rising and falling with the motion of the quake. One fisherman fell into the churning water, gasping for air as his friends pulled him back into the boat. "Row to shore!" someone shouted, but the shoreline itself was breaking apart. In the city's factories, machines rattled and collapsed. Gears clanged, steam pipes burst, and sparks lit up the dim spaces. Workers ran for the exits, pushing through falling debris. Daniel, who had just arrived at the factory, was knocked off his feet as the floor shifted beneath him. He crawled toward the door, coughing as dust filled his lungs. When he looked back, he saw the roof cave in, burying the machines under piles of bricks and steel. His heart pounded. He had barely made it out. The firehouse was in chaos. The fire bell, once a symbol of order, now clanged wildly, uncontrolled. Firefighters stumbled as they put on their boots and helmets. "This isn't just a tremor," the captain yelled. "This is the big one." He pointed toward the fire engines. "Get ready! There will be fires!" They knew he was right. Broken gas lines were already hissing, waiting for the first spark. Gas lamps exploded in the streets, sending fire shooting into the air. Smoke rose in dark, heavy clouds. Flames danced across rooftops, leaping from building to building. The city's wooden structures, dry from the warm spring air, became easy fuel for the firestorm. People ran through the streets, dodging falling bricks and burning debris. Some carried their children. Others dragged blankets filled with whatever belongings they could grab. An older man with a cane limped down the street, coughing from the smoke. A stranger ran to his side, throwing the man's arm over his shoulder. "Come on, sir. We have to get you out of here." The old man nodded, tears streaming down his face. Behind them, his home collapsed in a cloud of dust. The clock tower in the city center, once a symbol of time and order, stopped ticking. Its face cracked, its hands frozen at 5:14 a.m., just 2 minutes after the quake began. But in those 2 minutes, the city had changed forever. Near a collapsed bakery, the baker lay trapped beneath a wooden beam. His leg throbbed with pain. He shouted for help, but his voice was lost in the chaos. Flames flickered dangerously close to him. Just when he thought all hope was gone, 2 young men appeared. They lifted the beam and pulled him free. "We've got you," they said, dragging him away from the fire. As the shaking finally stopped, a heavy silence fell over the city. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of dawn. It was the silence of shock. People stood in the streets, covered in dust, staring at the destruction around them. Some cried. Others were too stunned to speak. Little Anna clung to her mother's dress, her small hands trembling. "Is it over?" she asked. Her mother looked around at the broken buildings, the rising smoke, the injured neighbors. She didn't know what to say. Tears filled her eyes, but she forced a smile. "For now, sweetheart, but we have to be brave." From the hills, the view of the city was terrifying. Fires spread rapidly, painting the sky with a dark orange glow. The once bustling streets were now filled with rubble. And somewhere beneath the ruins, people were trapped, waiting for help. The earthquake had ended, but the disaster was far from over. The city of dreams was now a city of survival. Chapter 5. The Firestorm Begins. As if the earthquake wasn't enough, the fires took over. It started small. Sparks leapt from broken gas pipes, dancing in the air. One spark landed on a pile of fallen wood. Another found a curtain, torn and hanging from a shattered window. Within seconds, the fabric burst into flames. The fire crawled up the walls like a hungry animal. In moments, it reached the roof and exploded outward. Smoke filled the sky. "Fire!" someone shouted, their voice echoing down the street. People turned to look, their eyes wide with fear. They had barely escaped the earthquake. Now they had to escape again. On Market Street, flames jumped from one building to the next. Broken windows and crumbling walls made it easy for the fire to spread. A store filled with fabric and clothes became a furnace. The fire swallowed it whole, sending black smoke pouring into the street. Men, women, and children ran, coughing and covering their faces with their sleeves. A mother pulled her two sons close, shouting, "Don't stop! Keep going!" Behind them, a building collapsed in a shower of sparks. The fire roared louder than the screams of the fleeing crowd. At the firehouse, the bell rang continuously. The firefighters, covered in dust from the quake, were already exhausted. But they didn't stop. They raced toward the fires with hoses and axes, their faces set with determination. Captain James wiped the sweat from his brow as he shouted orders. "Over there! Block that street! Don't let the fire spread past this point." But it was spreading faster than they could fight it. Broken water mains from the earthquake meant many hydrants were dry. The firefighters connected their hoses, but only a trickle of water came out. One man kicked the ground in frustration. "We need more water!" he yelled. But the city's lifeline had been cut. In Chinatown, the flames consumed everything in their path. Mrs. Lee stood in front of her shop, watching it burn. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a small wooden box to her chest. Inside were family photos, letters from her mother, and the last of her savings. She had escaped with only this, and her life. A neighbor pulled her arm. "We have to go," he cried. She nodded, her heart breaking as she turned away from everything she'd built. Near the docks, the fire burned through warehouses filled with goods waiting to be shipped. Barrels of oil exploded, sending fireballs into the sky. Fishermen, who had escaped the violent waters during the quake, now watched as the flames consumed the harbor. One man dropped to his knees, his hands shaking. His boat, his only source of income, was gone. As dawn broke, the city was hidden under a thick blanket of smoke. The rising sun turned the sky a dark orange, casting an eerie glow over the destruction. Ash rained down like snow, covering the streets, the rooftops, and the people running for their lives. Anna and her mother stumbled down the hill, their faces dirty with ash and tears. Anna clung to her doll, the only thing she had saved from their home. "Mama, will our house be okay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her mother didn't answer. She couldn't. Their house was already gone, swallowed by the flames, but she couldn't tell Anna that. "We'll be fine," she whispered, holding her daughter's hand tightly. Firefighters used dynamite to destroy buildings in the fire's path. The hope was that by removing fuel, the fire would have nothing to burn. The explosions shook the ground, adding to the chaos. But even this desperate tactic didn't work. The wind picked up, carrying embers across the city. New fires ignited wherever the embers landed. On Nob Hill, the grand mansions were now in the fire's path. The rich, who had once watched the destruction from their balconies, now packed their carriages with whatever valuables they could carry. One man, dressed in a silk robe, tried to load paintings into his carriage. A servant tugged his sleeve. "Sir, we have to leave now." The man dropped the painting and climbed into the carriage, tears streaming down his face as the flames closed in. By midday, the fire covered more than 500 city blocks. Churches, schools, theaters, and businesses were gone. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to piles of ash and rubble. The fire showed no mercy. It didn't care if you were rich or poor, young or old. It devoured everything. At the edge of the city, Daniel sat on the ground, watching the smoke rise into the sky. His factory was gone. His job was gone. Everything he had worked for had disappeared in a single morning. He clenched his fists, feeling the weight of hopelessness settle over him. But then he looked around and saw others, men, women, and children, who had lost even more. People who didn't have homes to go back to. People who didn't even have shoes on their feet. He stood up. He couldn't give up. Not now. The fire raged on through the night, but by the next morning, the city's spirit had not been destroyed. Survivors gathered in parks and open spaces, sharing food, blankets, and stories. They comforted one another. Strangers became friends. The fire had taken their homes, but it hadn't taken their will to survive. The firestorm had tested them, but they would fight back, together. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on WooEnglish. Remember, this content is specially made for WooEnglish listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of WooEnglish's rights. please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 6. A City in Panic. Running feet, crying children, desperate shouts. The streets of San Francisco, once filled with laughter and music, were now filled with chaos. People ran in every direction, pushing past one another. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, all were equal in their fear. Dust covered their faces. Tears streamed down their cheeks. A young woman, barefoot and trembling, carried a baby wrapped in a blanket. The child wailed, its tiny fists clenched in fear. "Hush, my love," the woman whispered, though her own voice shook. Her eyes darted left and right, searching for a place. Any place that felt safe. Behind her, flames leapt from rooftops. Sparks rained down like fireflies. Nearby, a man in a torn suit waved his arms, shouting, "This way! To the park!" His voice was drowned out by the noise of crumbling buildings and panicked cries. He grabbed the hand of an elderly woman struggling to walk. "I'll help you," he said, pulling her along as she stumbled over broken stones. In Union Square, families huddled together on the grass. They clung to one another, some praying, others silent. Children cried, their small hands gripping their mother's skirts. An old man, sitting alone, stared at the rising smoke, his eyes filled with disbelief. "I built my home with these hands," he murmured, showing his blistered palms. "Now it's gone." At the edge of the park, a boy no older than 10 sat on the ground, clutching a toy horse. He rocked back and forth, whispering, "Papa will find me. Papa will find me." His voice was soft, but his eyes were wide with fear. A kind woman knelt next to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him together," she promised. The docks were no safer. Crowds gathered near the water, hoping to escape by boat. Fishermen tried to steer their vessels through the waves, but the broken harbor made it difficult. A man in a wool coat shouted, "Make room!" "Let the children board first." People pressed against him, desperate to get on. The boat rocked dangerously, nearly tipping into the sea. A horse, wild with fear, bolted down the street, its hooves striking sparks on the cobblestones. Its owner, a young boy, chased after it, screaming its name. "Milo! Milo, come back!" But the horse disappeared into the smoke. The boy collapsed to the ground, sobbing. A passing stranger helped him to his feet. "Come on, son. We need to get you out of here." Daniel, covered in soot, stumbled down the street, his lungs burning from the smoke. He had spent the morning helping neighbors escape their collapsing homes. Now he could barely stand. His legs trembled as he leaned against a wall. But when he saw a woman trapped under a fallen wooden beam, he forced himself forward. "Hold on," he said, coughing. He used all his strength to lift the beam just enough for her to crawl out. She gasped for air, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel nodded, too exhausted to speak. In the chaos, acts of kindness flickered like small lights in the dark. A baker handed out loaves of bread to hungry families. A doctor, his hands shaking, bandaged wounds with strips of cloth torn from his own shirt. A group of boys carried buckets of water, though they knew the fires were too large to stop. "We have to try," one of them said. But was anywhere truly safe? Even the open fields had their dangers. Smoke drifted through the air, making it hard to breathe. Ash fell like snow, covering the grass. People lay on blankets, coughing and wiping their eyes. Mothers rocked their babies, singing lullabies to calm them. Fathers built makeshift tents from blankets and broken boards. But the fear never left their eyes. Near the mission district, Anna sat with her mother under a tree. The doll she had clung to was gone, lost during the escape. She sniffled, resting her head on her mother's lap. "When will we go home, Mama?" she asked softly. Her mother stroked her hair, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Soon, my love," she whispered. "We just need to be patient." But she knew their home was likely gone. The city's leaders tried to restore order. Soldiers patrolled the streets, their boots pounding against the pavement. They shouted commands, urging people to stay calm. "Move to the camps! Stay together!" But even the soldiers looked worried. They had never seen destruction like this. At a temporary shelter in Golden Gate Park, a group of volunteers handed out blankets and bowls of soup. Some people cried with relief as they sat down to eat. Others stared blankly into their bowls, too overwhelmed to think of food. A young girl shared her bread with a stray dog that had wandered into the camp. The dog wagged its tail, offering a brief moment of comfort in the midst of chaos. As night fell, the fires continued to burn. The glow of the flames lit up the sky, casting long shadows across the city. People lay on the ground, huddled together for warmth. Some whispered prayers, others simply held hands, finding strength in each other. The panic was far from over. Many wondered if it ever would be. But for now, they had survived the day. They had escaped the worst of the destruction. And although their city lay in ruins, the spirit of its people was not broken. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under the smoky sky, they held on to hope. They had to. Chapter 7. Survivors Speak. "The ground felt like it wanted to swallow us whole," said Maria, her voice trembling as she recalled that morning. She sat on a bench in Golden Gate Park, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Around her, children played, unaware of the pain hidden in her memories. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. "I was sweeping the kitchen floor when it started," she continued. "At first, I thought it was just another small quake, but then the floor moved, like a wave beneath my feet." She shivered. "The pots fell. The walls cracked. I heard people screaming upstairs. My first thought was, I need to get my son." Her son, only 4 years old, had been sleeping in their small apartment above the bakery where she worked. Maria wiped her eyes. "I ran up the stairs, but the staircase was shaking so badly I thought I'd fall. When I reached his room, he was crying. I grabbed him, and we ran outside. Behind us, the bakery collapsed. We were lucky. Very lucky. Nearby, another survivor spoke softly, his words heavy with emotion. His name was Thomas, a hotel cook who had worked the morning shift at the Palace Hotel. "I was preparing breakfast when it hit," he said, staring at the ground. "The pans flew off the stove. The walls cracked like dry wood snapping." He shook his head. "We had guests, rich businessmen, tourists. They panicked. Some ran for the exits, others hid under tables. The floor beneath me buckled. I thought we were done for." But Thomas didn't give up. He pointed to a scar on his arm. "I was burned by boiling water, but I didn't feel the pain at the time. My only thought was to help. I pulled people from under tables, guided them through the smoke-filled halls. One woman couldn't walk. Her ankle was broken. I carried her out." His voice softened. "I don't remember how many people I helped. I just remember running, coughing, and praying." He leaned back, his eyes distant. "The hotel burned down. Everything gone. But we lived. That's what matters." Then there was Mr. Patel, a shopkeeper from Chinatown. His small grocery store had been his pride and joy. "I came to San Francisco with nothing but hope," he said. "I built my business from scratch. My wife and I worked day and night." He paused, staring at his hands. In minutes, it was all destroyed. The walls fell. The roof caved in. Shelves of rice, flour, and tea were buried under bricks. But even as the earth crumbled, his first thought wasn't the store. It was his family. "I couldn't find them," he said, his voice cracking. "I searched the streets, calling their names. I was terrified. My wife, my 2 daughters. I didn't know if they were alive." Hours passed before he finally found them in a temporary camp near the docks. His wife held their youngest daughter in her arms, their older daughter sitting beside her, crying. "We lost everything," he said, "but seeing them alive, it was like being given another chance." Then there was Lucy, a 12-year-old girl who had become a hero in her neighborhood. "We were in our house when it started," she said, sitting cross-legged on the grass, her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. "The walls shook so hard, I thought the roof would fall on us." Her little brother, only 6 years old, had been playing with his toys when the shaking began. "He was frozen," she said. "He didn't move. He just sat there crying." Lucy took action. She grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the door. Our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, was stuck. She couldn't get out of her house because the door frame had collapsed. Lucy bit her lip. "I don't know how, but I found a piece of wood and used it to pry the door open." She was crying, saying she couldn't move, but I kept telling her, "You can do it, just one step at a time." Lucy's bravery didn't end there. Once they were outside, she noticed flames spreading toward another house. "There was a dog trapped inside," she said. "I heard it barking. Without thinking, I ran back in and opened the door. The dog bolted out, and I ran after it." She laughed nervously. Looking back, it was probably dangerous, but I didn't think about that at the time. I just knew I had to help. Her neighborhood later called her the little hero. But Lucy didn't see it that way. "I was scared," she said, "really scared. But I knew that if I didn't do something, people could get hurt." The survivors shared these stories quietly, their voices carrying both pain and pride. They had lost homes, businesses, memories, but they had saved lives, helped strangers, and found strength they never knew they had. As the sun set over the city, casting its golden glow on the ruins, Maria spoke again. "We survived," she said softly. "We have scars, yes, but we are still here." She looked at the other survivors and smiled faintly. "We will rebuild. We will start over." And in that moment, under the smoky sky, they all knew one thing. The city may have fallen, but its spirit had not. Chapter 8. The Aftershock. Just when they thought it was over, the morning had been filled with chaos. Families escaped the fires, carrying only what they could. The ground had stopped shaking, and people believed they had survived the worst. They gathered in camps, huddled under blankets, in parks, on hills, and by the waterfront. The air smelled of smoke and ash, but there was hope in their eyes. Until the aftershock came. It hit without warning. The earth groaned, and then it jolted violently. Mothers screamed as they clutched their children. Fathers, who had stood strong moments before, fell to their knees. The tremor was short, but its power was deadly. Anna, still holding her mother's hand, cried out as the ground shifted beneath her feet. She stumbled, scraping her knee on the rocky ground. "Mama!" she sobbed. Her mother scooped her up, holding her close. "I've got you," she whispered, though her voice was shaking. Across the city, buildings that had barely survived the first quake now crumbled. A church steeple, cracked and leaning, gave way. It toppled to the ground, sending clouds of dust into the sky. People ran from the debris, coughing and shouting. The bells, once used to call worshippers to prayer, clanged one last time before falling silent. In the camps, fear spread like wildfire. Tents collapsed as the ground beneath them twisted. "Not again!" someone cried. A woman, holding a baby in her arms, fell to the ground as the tremor threw her off balance. A man rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. The baby cried, its tiny face red and frightened. Thomas, the hotel cook, had been resting near a group of injured survivors. When the aftershock hit, he jumped to his feet. He saw a woman fall and rushed to help her. "Are you hurt?" he asked, pulling her up. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, but I thought it was over," she whispered. "I thought we were safe." In Chinatown, the streets were already filled with rubble. The aftershock made things worse. Walls that had been barely standing came crashing down. A group of men ran through the narrow alleys, dodging falling bricks and wooden beams. One man shouted, "This way!" as he led them toward an open space. Behind them, a small shop collapsed, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Daniel, still recovering from helping his neighbors earlier that morning, had been resting against a tree. When the ground shook again, He jumped up, his heart racing. He looked around, scanning the camp for anyone who needed help. He saw a young boy crying, his face covered in dirt. Daniel ran to him, kneeling down. "Are you okay?" The boy sobbed, pointing toward the wreckage of a nearby building. "My dog. He's still inside." Daniel didn't hesitate. He ran toward the building, carefully stepping over broken glass and fallen beams. Inside, he heard the dog whining. The walls creaked, threatening to collapse at any moment. "Come on, boy," Daniel called softly, moving closer. The small brown dog, covered in dust, limped toward him. Daniel scooped the dog into his arms and ran back outside just as the ceiling gave way behind him. The boy ran to Daniel, tears turning into a smile. "Thank you," he cried, hugging his dog. But not everyone was as lucky. In one corner of the city, a group of rescue workers dug through the rubble of a collapsed building. They worked quickly, their hands blistered from lifting heavy stones. "There's someone trapped under here," one man shouted. They could hear faint cries for help beneath the debris. A woman's voice, weak but determined, called out, "Please, help me!" The workers pushed harder, tossing debris to the side. "We're coming!" they shouted, but the aftershock had made the job more dangerous. The pile shifted, threatening to bury them as well. One of the workers hesitated. "It's too dangerous," he warned. The leader of the group shook his head. "We can't leave her," he said firmly. "We have to try." Together, they lifted a large wooden beam, revealing the woman underneath. She was covered in dust, her leg pinned under broken bricks. Gently, they pulled her free. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "Thank you, thank you." By the time the aftershock ended, the damage was done. Buildings that had once stood proudly were now piles of rubble. The city survivors, already shaken by the morning's disaster, were now filled with a new level of fear. How many more aftershocks would come? How much more could they take? At the edge of the camp, Anna's mother sat on the ground, cradling her daughter in her arms. Anna had stopped crying, but her small body trembled. "Mama, will it come again?" she asked softly. Her mother kissed her forehead, her own tears falling onto Anna's hair. "I don't know," she admitted, "but we'll stay together, no matter what." In the distance, the fires still burned. Smoke rose into the sky, turning the sunlight a hazy orange. People sat in silence, their faces blank with shock. Some prayed, others simply held hands. But as the sun set over the city, one thing became clear. The survivors were not just fighting the earthquake or the fires. They were fighting to hold on to hope. And hope, though fragile, was still alive. Chapter 9. The Spirit of Hope. Amid the ashes, something beautiful began to grow. The earthquake had destroyed homes, shops, and schools. Fires had turned neighborhoods into piles of smoldering rubble. Fear had gripped the city. But when the ground stopped shaking and the fires cooled, hope began to take its place. In the open fields of Golden Gate Park, families huddled together under makeshift tents made from blankets and broken wood. They had lost everything, but they hadn't lost their will to survive. Despite their hunger and exhaustion, people found strength in each other. Maria sat on the grass, holding her son close. The boy, only 4 years old, cried softly. "I want to go home," he whispered. Maria wiped the tears from his cheeks and kissed his forehead. "I know, my love," she said gently, "but we're safe here. That's what matters." She looked around at the other families sitting nearby. Some cried, others whispered quietly to one another. But despite the sadness, Maria noticed something else. People were helping one another. A man walked through the camp, handing out small pieces of bread. His clothes were torn and his hands were dirty, but he smiled as he gave food to children. "It's not much," he said, "but it's something." When he reached Maria, she took the bread and thanked him. "Bless you," she whispered, breaking the piece in half to share with her son. Nearby, Daniel worked with a group of men to set up a large tent for the injured. His muscles ached, and his shirt was soaked with sweat, but he didn't stop. "Over here," someone shouted, waving him over to help lift a wooden pole. Together, they secured the tent and began laying blankets on the ground. Inside, doctors and nurses worked tirelessly. They bandaged wounds, treated burns, and comforted the frightened. One doctor, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, knelt next to a young girl with a broken arm. "Does it hurt, sweetie?" he asked softly. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. He smiled gently and said, "You're very brave. We'll fix you up." He worked quickly, wrapping her arm in a makeshift cast. Outside the tent, neighbors who had never spoken before were now working side by side. An elderly woman handed out cups of water to passing children. A young man used a shovel to clear debris from a path, creating a safe walkway through the camp. A woman who had lost her home sat by the fire, knitting a scarf from scraps of yarn she had salvaged. "It keeps my hands busy," she explained to those watching her. "And maybe someone will need it when the nights get colder." Lucy, the 12-year-old girl who had saved her brother and their neighbor during the quake, was now helping again. She walked through the camp with a bucket of water, offering sips to anyone who needed it. When she saw a boy sitting alone, crying, she knelt down beside him. "What's wrong?" she asked. He wiped his nose and looked at her. "I can't find my dog," he whispered. Lucy's heart ached. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find him," she promised. "I'll help you." The boy sniffled and nodded. Together, they walked through the camp, asking anyone if they had seen the missing dog. Finally, near the edge of the camp, they heard a familiar bark. The boy's face lit up as he ran to his dog, wrapping his arms around the small brown animal. "You found him," he cried, looking back at Lucy with a wide smile. "Thank you." Acts of kindness spread like ripples in a pond. People who had lost everything gave what little they could. A man who had saved a bag of rice shared it with his neighbors. A woman who had found a crate of apples handed them out to hungry children. Laughter, though rare, began to return to the camp. As night fell, The survivors gathered around fires for warmth, the glow of the flames reflected in their tired eyes. Some shared stories about their homes, their families, and their memories of better times. Others sang softly, their voices blending with the crackling fire. Thomas, the hotel cook who had saved several guests during the quake, sat next to an elderly man. The man held a small photograph in his hands, staring at it silently. "Is that your family?" Thomas asked gently. The man nodded, his lips trembling. "My wife, my daughter," he whispered. "They're gone." Thomas placed a hand on the man's shoulder. "I'm so sorry," he said, "but you're not alone. We're all in this together." The man wiped his tears and managed a small smile. "Thank you," he said softly. "That means more than you know." Around one fire, a group of children laughed as they roasted small pieces of bread on sticks. Their laughter was a reminder that, even in the darkest times, life continued. Hope continued. The mayor of the city, standing on a hill overlooking the camp, watched the scene below. His heart was heavy with the weight of the destruction. But seeing people share food, build tents, and comfort one another filled him with a sense of pride. "We will rebuild," he whispered to himself. "This city will rise again." And in that moment, he knew that San Francisco's spirit had not been broken. The survivors were tired, hungry, and grieving, but they had something that could never be destroyed: hope. Together, they would heal. Together, they would rebuild. And together, they would prove that even in the face of disaster, humanity could shine its brightest. Chapter 10. Rebuilding from Ruin. As the smoke cleared, reality set in. The city they once knew was gone. Streets were filled with broken bricks, twisted steel, and piles of ash. More than 80% of San Francisco had been destroyed. Churches, schools, homes, all reduced to rubble. But where there was destruction, there was also determination. The mayor, standing on the steps of what was once City Hall, addressed a crowd of weary survivors. His voice echoed through the dusty air. "We will rebuild," he said firmly. "San Francisco will rise again." His words sparked hope, and that hope became action. Engineers, architects, and builders gathered to plan the new city. They studied the damage, learning from the mistakes of the past. "We need stronger materials," one engineer said. "Brick and wood won't survive another earthquake." They decided to use steel and reinforced concrete for future buildings. Streets were redesigned to be wider and safer, with fire-resistant barriers to prevent future disasters. It wasn't easy. Supplies were scarce. Workers were tired. But no one gave up. In the Mission District, Maria stood in front of her destroyed bakery. She could still see where the oven had been, though it was now buried under broken wood and shattered glass. Her son tugged on her dress. "Can we fix it, Mama?" he asked softly. Maria knelt down, placing her hands on his small shoulders. "Yes," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears. "We will fix it. It will take time, but we will bake bread here again." she wasn't alone. Neighbors worked side by side, clearing debris from the streets. Men lifted heavy beams while women swept away ash. Children helped carry buckets of broken bricks to dump sites. Every small act of labor felt like a step toward healing. Daniel joined a team of volunteers who rebuilt homes. His hands were blistered and his muscles ached, but he didn't stop. "Every nail we hammer brings us closer to normal," he said as he helped raise a new wooden frame. He had lost his factory job, but that didn't matter now. The city needed him, and he was ready to help. One day, as he worked on a roof, he spotted Lucy walking by with her brother. She waved and smiled. "You're doing a great job up there," she shouted. Daniel grinned. "Thanks, Lucy. How's your new home?" Lucy beamed with pride. "It's small, but it's ours," she said. After the earthquake, her family had lived in a tent for weeks. But with the community's help, they had built a small wooden house. "My brother has his own room now," she added with a laugh. "He says it's better than the old house." At Golden Gate Park, where thousands of people had once camped, the tents began to disappear. As families moved back into their homes, or what remained of them, parks and streets slowly returned to life. Children played games in the open spaces, their laughter filling the air once more. Vendors returned, selling fresh fruit, flowers, and hot coffee. Not all the changes were visible. People had changed too. They had learned to depend on one another. Neighbors who had once been strangers were now friends. They shared food, tools, and advice. "We couldn't have made it without each other," said Mr. Patel, the shopkeeper from Chinatown. His grocery store had been rebuilt with donations and the help of volunteers. "I lost everything," he said, "but I gained a family." The city's leaders didn't just want to rebuild. They wanted to make San Francisco stronger than ever. New building codes were put in place to ensure that future structures could withstand earthquakes. Architects designed taller buildings using steel frames, creating the first modern skyscrapers in the city. The skyline began to change, symbolizing a new era of growth and innovation. One morning, Thomas, the hotel cook, walked past the site of the Palace Hotel. The grand building had burned to the ground, but construction workers were already laying the foundation for a new hotel. Thomas smiled to himself. "Someday, I'll cook here again," he whispered. "And it will be better than before." By the end of the year, progress was everywhere. Factories reopened. Streetcars once again rolled through the city. New homes, shops, and schools appeared where ruins had once stood. There was still much to do, but the spirit of the people kept the momentum going. On the 1-year anniversary of the earthquake, a large gathering was held in the city center. Survivors, workers, and city leaders came together to reflect on the journey they had taken. Maria brought fresh bread from her rebuilt bakery and handed it out to the crowd. Daniel stood proudly next to a house he had helped rebuild. Lucy, holding her brother's hand, looked up at the new skyline and smiled. A man stood on a makeshift stage reading a list of names, those who had lost their lives. Tears filled many eyes. But there was also pride. They had honored the memories of the fallen by rebuilding their home. As the sun set over the city, casting a golden glow on the new buildings, people held hands and sang. The song was one of hope, strength, and unity. It was a promise to keep moving forward. San Francisco had been broken, but it had healed. The scars of the disaster would remain, but so would the lessons learned. Steel beams now stood where weak walls had fallen. Friendships formed in the chaos had become unbreakable bonds. The city had risen again, stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next. Chapter 11. The Forgotten Voices. Not everyone had a voice in the rebuilding. As new buildings rose and the city began to hum with life once more, some stories were left untold. These were the stories of the workers, the immigrants, the poor, and the laborers who rebuilt San Francisco brick by brick. Their hands lifted the walls, but their voices were rarely heard. In Chinatown, Mr. Lee stood with a shovel in his hands. His back ached, and his fingers were raw from digging. He wiped the sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of dirt across his forehead. Around him, other Chinese workers cleared debris from the streets, filling carts with broken bricks and splintered wood. "We do the dirty work," Mr. Lee said, pausing for breath, "but no one will thank us." The Chinese community had suffered greatly. Their homes were destroyed, and many businesses were gone. When the city's leaders made plans to rebuild, Chinatown was almost erased from the map. Some officials wanted to move the Chinese residents to the outskirts of the city, far from the new downtown. But the community resisted. "This is our home," said Mrs. Lee, standing proudly in front of her damaged shop. "We've worked too hard to be pushed out." They fought for their place, and they won. Slowly, Chinatown came back to life. But it wasn't easy. Men like Mr. Lee worked long hours for little pay. They carried heavy stones, mixed cement, and built the city's walls while sleeping in small, crowded tents. Despite the hardships, they didn't stop. "We're building more than buildings," Mr. Lee said quietly. "We're building a future for our children." Across the city, Italian laborers also played a key role in the rebuilding. Many of them were stone masons and carpenters. Antonio, a young Italian man, had only arrived in San Francisco 2 years before the earthquake. He had come seeking a better life, but now his dreams felt far away. "I wanted to open my own shop," he said, driving a nail into a wooden beam. "But first, I have to help rebuild someone else's." Antonio and his crew worked on some of the city's most important projects. They repaired churches, schools, and factories. Each day, he would arrive before sunrise, carrying his toolbox over his shoulder. The work was exhausting. His hands blistered from holding hammers and saws, but he didn't complain. At night, he would walk home, the city lights flickering through the smoky air. "Someday," he whispered to himself, "this hard work will pay off." Nearby, Mexican workers helped clear the rubble from the collapsed docks. They worked under the hot sun, lifting heavy beams and loading them onto wagons. Many of them had been fishermen before the disaster, but now they were builders and laborers. One worker, Miguel, recalled the day the earthquake struck. "I lost my boat," he said softly. "It was my life, but I can't sit and cry about it. I have to rebuild." Miguel and his friends often worked without proper equipment. Their gloves were worn, their shoes thin, but they kept going. When the day's work ended, they would gather around small fires, sharing what little food they had. "We help each other," Miguel explained, "because no one else will." Women played a crucial role too, though their contributions were often overlooked. Maria, who had once baked bread for her neighborhood, now cooked for the workers rebuilding the streets. She set up a small kitchen near a construction site, using a large pot to make soup. "They need strength to keep working," she said, stirring the pot. The smell of garlic and onions filled the air, bringing comfort to those who passed by. Many immigrant women also took on sewing and laundry jobs, mending clothes and washing uniforms for the firefighters and rescue workers. Others became nurses, treating injured laborers who couldn't afford a doctor. They didn't expect recognition, but they knew their efforts mattered. "We are holding this city together," Maria said, "even if no one sees it." Despite the lack of acknowledgement, the workers found moments of triumph. One day, as Antonio helped finish the roof of a school, he looked out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the skyline. "We did this," he whispered to himself. "We built this with our hands." He smiled, feeling a rare sense of pride. In Chinatown, Mr. Lee watched as children ran through the streets, playing games and laughing. His own son chased after them, his face glowing with happiness. "This is why we work," Mr. Lee thought, "so they can have a better life." By the time the city had fully recovered, the forgotten voices had already moved on to their next jobs. They built bridges, railroads, and factories. Their names didn't appear in the newspapers, and their stories weren't written in history books. But their legacy remained. The walls they built were strong, and the communities they protected thrived. Years later, when tourists walked through the streets of Chinatown or admired the architecture of the city's grand buildings, they would have no idea how many hands had worked tirelessly to make it possible. But the workers knew. And that was enough. Chapter 12. The Legacy of 1906. San Francisco did rise again, but at a cost. The new city sparkled with modern buildings. Streets were wider, cleaner, and safer. Skyscrapers reached for the sky, their steel frames standing strong against future earthquakes. Parks were filled with laughter once more. Streetcars clanged along the tracks, and the harbor bustled with life. But beneath the surface of this rebuilt city, scars remained. Scars of loss, survival, and the people who never came back. In the heart of the city, a memorial stands tall. Names are carved into stone, names of those who were lost. Flowers are placed at its base every year, reminders that the memories have not faded. We survived, we rebuilt, and we will never forget. The inscription reads, "People pass by it on their way to work, pausing for a moment of reflection." Maria visits the memorial every April. She places a loaf of bread near the flowers, honoring the bakery she lost and the people who helped her rebuild. "It's a tradition," she says, holding her son's hand. He's no longer the frightened child she once carried through the streets. He's a young man now, studying engineering at a nearby university. "He wants to design buildings that won't fall," Maria says proudly. "He wants to keep people safe." Her son nods. "The earthquake shaped our family," he says. "It made us stronger." He dreams of one day building a school in the very spot where his childhood home once stood. In Chinatown, Mr. Lee runs a small tea shop. His walls are decorated with old photos, images of the ruined city, of workers clearing rubble, and of families rebuilding their homes. When tourists ask him about the photos, he tells them stories. "We didn't just survive," he says. "We thrived." He talks about the nights spent digging through debris and the mornings when they woke up to rebuild what they had lost. But there is always a pause when he talks about the friends who didn't make it. He lowers his voice and says, "We remember them in everything we do." Each cup of tea he serves, each brick he laid in the past, carries their memory forward. For engineers, architects, and city planners, the earthquake of 1906 is more than a tragic story. It's a lesson. New building codes were written. Safer designs were created. Engineers studied the damage and vowed to never let it happen again. Today, buildings in San Francisco are some of the safest in the world, designed to sway with the Earth's movements instead of crumbling under the pressure. Daniel, now a skilled builder, works on modern skyscrapers. He still remembers the day he pulled people from the wreckage and helped construct temporary shelters. "Back then, we built with what we had," he says. "Now, we build with knowledge." He points to a towering building made of steel and glass. That building can survive an earthquake. That's the legacy of 1906. Schools across the city teach children about the earthquake. They learn about the destruction, but they also learn about the strength of the community. Teachers show them photos of the rubble and then photos of the rebuilt city. "Look at what we achieved," they say. "Look at what we can do when we work together." Lucy, once the young girl who saved her brother and their neighbor, is now a teacher herself. She tells her students her story, the fear, the bravery, and the moments of kindness that kept her going. "I was your age when it happened," she says, looking into their curious faces. "And I learned that even the smallest act of courage can make a difference." Her students sit silently, absorbing her words. Then one boy raises his hand. "Were you scared?" he asks. Lucy smiles softly. "Very scared," she admits. But courage isn't about not being scared. It's about helping others, even when you are. The legacy of 1906 lives not just in the city's buildings, but in its people. It lives in the volunteers who help after disasters, in the architects who design safer structures, and in the families who pass down stories of survival. Every April, the city holds a commemoration. Survivors, their children, and grandchildren gather at the memorial. They hold hands and bow their heads in silence, remembering the fallen. Some bring flowers. Others bring notes, placing them gently on the ground. "Thank you for your strength," one note reads. "We will honor your memory by living with courage." The city also honors the workers whose hands rebuilt San Francisco. Streets are named after them. Plaques mark the spots where they worked, and museums tell their stories. Without them, none of this would be here, says a tour guide, pointing to the skyline. They are the foundation of everything we see today. But even as the city moves forward, it never forgets. One evening, as the sun sets over the bay, casting its golden light on the water, a man stands at the top of Nob Hill. He looks out at the city below. The glow of streetlights, the hum of life, and the towering buildings fill him with pride. This is his home. It was broken, but they put it back together. And it is stronger than ever. As he walks down the hill, he passes the memorial. He pauses, running his fingers over the engraved names. We survived. We rebuilt. And we will never forget. He reads aloud. His voice is soft, but in the quiet evening air, it carries far. And in that moment, the city, once again, feels alive.